Michelle Alexander, a legal scholar and law professor at Ohio State University, has written a text called The New Jim Crow. In this text, she invites readers to consider the relationship between race, racial control, and incarceration. Her major claim is, the war on drugs is the new Jim Crow. In part one, we discussed her notion of the new Jim Crow. In part two, we will examine and discuss her notion of colorblindness and the dangers associated with it. As we examine her provocative thesis in the light of our personal and professional experience, I hope our viewers and participants will be motivated to explore the significance of Alexander's text for Fresno County and beyond.
Thank you, Karen, Steve, and Robert for being here for the second part of our discussion on the new Jim Crow. If you were here last week, you're in a very good place to begin the conversation with us again or continue it. If you're beginning fresh, stay tuned. You're going to learn an awful lot about a very important topic that we have only covered once on a forum, and that was last week. Our studio guests to help us this week are the Reverend Dr. Karen Crozier, an educator, minister, and scholar activist who is committed in her own way as best she can to be an agent of God's love, hope, and justice in our world. Across from me on the left would be Dr. Steve Varvis, who is returning to our program after a few years of not being here. He's the interim provost at the beautiful Fresno Pacific University, where Karen is also a professor. Thanks, Steve, for coming back. And very much across from me is a good new friend, Robert K. Mitchell, Jr., MD, who is a community physician serving West Fresno, and he is a physician, a community physician, and a social activist himself. Thank you, panel, for being here to help us dig even deeper into the question. I'd like to begin, as I did last week, with a quote from Miss Alexander. In the era of colorblindness, she says, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather, she says, rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, she says, it's perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, she insists, the old forms of discrimination, such as employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunities, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion even from jury service. These are suddenly legal. Finally, as a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. As she sees it, we have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it. With that opening thought, I wonder if we could get all of you to weigh in on this one from your own professional and personal perspectives. What do you think of her definition of colorblindness, and what validity does any of this have in your experience? Dr. Mitchell, could you open up?
Well, I believe her definition or attempt to define colorblindness as it relates to us all in this country, I think it's a great notion, it's a great vision, but it's much too soon. One of the major themes in a book by James Baldwin and Margaret Mead, 1970, A Rap on Race, one of the major themes of that book was denial and what you set yourself up for by denying. So denying the truth, denying history, the past, denying what's going on today, the present, somewhat writes your future. And so we have to be cognizant of that and go back and unearth these things that James Baldwin and Margaret Mead talked about in 1970 as well.
Steve, from your experience as an educator, where would you like to weigh in?
Well, in education at all levels, but especially in higher education where I serve, we have to be conscious of race continually. We're measured on student outcomes by race, by gender, by class, and we have to report on it to our accreditors, to the federal government, and are held accountable for the success of anyone that we admit as a student.
Karen, you're at the same university. How would you like to nuance or have an understanding that you could share that confirms, edges a little, reforms or morphs anything that's been shared so far?
Well, first of all, I would like to make mention of Michelle's, as a legal scholar, discussing an era of colorblindness, because that suggests that we move from one era to another era. So where the dominant ideology concerning race was denigration and disenfranchisement and seeing black people as less than human, now we are entering into an era, oh, I'm colorblind and I don't see race, so I'm rendered invisible. And that goes back to what my colleague and supervisor, who's sitting to my left, stated as far as educational systems are mandated to see color based upon the reportings that they have to do. But oftentimes, many people of color feel like they are just a number and are just merely there because we fulfill the government's, we fulfill a particular government demand so that the school, the institution can receive funds, but we're not necessarily the recipient of those funds. And it goes back to another legal scholar, Derek Bell argued several years ago, and we are not saved, and looking at the various ways African Americans were not the recipients of various affirmative action policies that were designed for us.
Dr. Mitchell, trick question here, it's not on the script. As a community physician, with that lens, where would you see colorblindness fitting in with anything Michelle says in your own experience?
As a community, let me stray away from the community physician and give you my own historical perspective, so to speak. Colorblind, not the case. As a student, high school student, referencing and going back to what you all were speaking about, simply being a number, and what I spoke about earlier, that there's this history that you can't deny that comes with that student, that person. As a high school student, engaging my high school counselor on several occasions, I was only afforded military applications on several occasions.
Oh my.
Was I a straight A student? By no stretch of the imagination. But those other individuals that received applications to Fresno State and counseling regarding collegiate entrance exams and things like that, I did just as well as. So you have to take the history of this group of individuals into account. And I thought sharing that experience might give you a bit more.
Very, very enlightening.
Okay.
So I just want to add, thank you, Robert, for bringing that out. As far as in the era of colorblindness, we've been seeing color for a long time.
Exactly.
But yet there's a dominant ideology that people want to use as if we are now moved in a post-racial society, moved to a post-racial society where race doesn't matter, when it does matter.
Race Matters, which we'll talk later about that in that wonderful book by Cornel West. Now, doing history, we should think of great people of history, of which one of them is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, in his letter from the Birmingham jail, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote some powerful words.
Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly.
Now, Dr. King was in jail as he was working to raise consciousness around how the Jim Crow South was unjustly treating African Americans, or Negroes as they were called at that time. I wonder if the panel can help us unpack this question. Today, what connections does Michelle Alexander make between the Jim Crow South of that time and the colorblindness that she feels has definitely, statistically, and incontrovertibly contributed to the mass incarceration of black males, which is her major thesis? Where would we like to go with that?
Well, I'll weigh in on this. It seems to me that the old Jim Crow rendered black people invisible. The new Jim Crow and colorblindness similarly renders people invisible. And so when we look at the prison yard, we don't see it filled with black males. And if we can see through color, we ought to be raising questions. Why the high proportion? Why are they there and not others? If we can't ask those questions because we can't see color or race, then we don't know how to answer these questions. We can't solve the problems that we see. We can't seek the kind of justice that we've been talking about.
To build up on that, one difference is that King spoke in a time when it was legal to discriminate against African Americans because of the color of their skin. Today in Alexander, she lives and speaks in a time when it's not legal or socially acceptable to do so. So therefore, we have something to consider when we look at the context of color blindness as it continues to play out when color is actually playing a role in what is happening. In the letter from the Birmingham jail, King is also speaking to clergy who thought he should be able to be quiet, be patient, because the country was not ready for this new reality of racial equality and integration. And also, King lived in Atlanta, Georgia, and was coming to Birmingham. And so therefore, they said he was an outsider. But King is reminding us that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and it affects us all, so we are interconnected in this process. So likewise, Alexander is pushing us to think about our brothers who are behind bars, locked up and locked out of the system. And she shares, just as then a civil war had to be waged to end slavery, a mass movement was necessary to bring a formal end to Jim Crow. Some would argue it didn't end. But then she goes on to say, those who imagine that far less is required to dismantle mass incarceration and build a new egalitarian racial consensus reflecting a compassionate rather than punitive impulse toward poor people of color failed to appreciate the distance between Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream and the ongoing racial nightmare for those locked up and locked out of the American society. And basically, Alexander is saying we are living a racial nightmare because mass incarceration, according to her, is one step from genocide. Some could argue it is a form of genocide. And so therefore, we need racial champions on every level to engage the immensity of what she names as a new Jim Crow in light of an era of color blindness, of seeing color but not acknowledging the reality of seeing color.
We do have to take our break at this point, but please stay tuned because we'll be back for the second half of this program in the concluding segment of our series on the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration in an age of color blindness. Stay tuned.
KNXT thanks all its loyal viewers and respected businesses who have supported your Catholic television station. Now you can support KNXT with program underwriting by having your name, your company's name, or organization associated with your favorite program. Detailed information about you or your company will appear before and after each program or day part you select. Keep the quality and spiritual message alive and make a difference. Call 559-488-7440 today or go online at knxt.tv to find out more about program underwriting on KNXT.
Hello again and welcome back to our discussion on the new Jim Crow. I hope that those who are watching this program are really becoming challenged or actually inspired to dig deeper. And we're going to be sharing with you some resources in the last half of the program of where there'd be other readings and other persons to satisfy your need for more, not information, but perhaps a foundation in this new way to think. It is definitely a provocative topic that we're raising with you. My question right now as we begin this is to all three of you, and I think Karen could maybe start us off. Why do you think Alexander is pushing us, her readers and her public, to see color? Because it seems like it's easier to be colorblind. So why is she challenging us to see color, Karen?
Basically, she's inviting us to see color because race matters have not been adequately addressed in this country. Cornel West, nearly 20 years ago, wrote one of his classic texts called Race Matters, which engages the realities of what is happening and not happening around race and the ways that this country continues to perpetuate its racist ideology and not take responsibility for the ways that disenfranchisement continues in housing and education for many African Americans. And so therefore she's saying this is not done to exacerbate the racial divide in our ability to see color, but it invites us to engage the way that color is playing out in our society so that we can begin to engage it and erase the negative impacts of the ways that race functions in our society.
Robert, where would you see the next step then? Alexander, how do you respond to her request to start seeing color more clearly?
Well, she definitely reminds us. There's a chapter in the book called The Fire Next Time. James Baldwin wrote, hers is called The Fire This Time. James Baldwin's book is called, The Fire Next Time. So she's actually telling us, hey, this is here and now, let's deal with it. So she's attempting to raise our consciousness about this very serious matter that the nation is inextricably linked to. James Baldwin and Margaret Mead wrestled with this, and if we don't, as they say, or as he said, insist as lovers do at creating the other's consciousness, we'll be in a big mess.
Which we are, definitely. And Steve?
I think in the simplest terms, if we don't see color, don't notice, and state what we see, then we don't see what's there. We see something false, we create a myth, and we can't respond appropriately.
And it might be that we have to all own that. This is maybe seeming academic, this conversation, but believe it or not, it's very personal and very practical and real. I am finding from my reading and from being in this panel a challenge to see reality and accept it and not leave it not worked with either. Denied or avoided. We can't do that. We don't have that luxury. How does Michelle Alexander, as we move along to the final questions about her book, how does she invite us to see color? And is she being racist in calling us to be more conscious of race, of color? Karen.
No! No! No, again, she is being redemptive in light of the context of an age of color blindness. And she calls her readers to move from a place of racial indifference to an ethic of compassion, because racial indifference means that you're not caring about race matters or people from other races, of other races. Now, myself as a color consciousness person, and as my colleague and friend, Dr. Robert Mitchell was sharing, we have realized the negative impact throughout our history of his high school years and the realities of what that meant for us in the ways that color is seen. And so therefore she's saying we need to see more deeply and more critically and be able to take responsibility for the ways that we are still inflicted by race-ism.
How does this work for you, Steve?
Well, my experience obviously isn't the same as Robert's or Karen's, but I've had to learn from the experience of my African American colleagues at the university, my Hispanic colleagues, who have at least tried to help me to see what's happening when we're sitting in a meeting discussing something and someone's being ignored, or when students aren't recognized for who they are. And so the attempt to engage us to see the racial patterns that we all engage in is part of the education so that we can work with students in the university setting to be successful and to treat them as people, full people, in ways that, as Karen calls, are redemptive.
Karen, could you tell us a little bit about another presenter, author, scholar, Eduardo Bonilla Silva from Puerto Rico? What insight does Dr. Silva share that you found very interesting also?
Well, with his background being a sociologist and Michelle Alexander's being a legal scholar and law professor, it's a nice, they're very compatible with one another because his text is racism without racists. And so therefore, too, he is naming the reality of a colorblind society, and he invites his readers to move from being quote-unquote non-racist to hopefully anti-racist, because it becomes another construct that does not allow us to move to, as Steve was sharing, to human flourishing in the care of all of God's people, all human beings.
Do either of the fellas have a follow-up thing about the difference between being non-racist or anti-racist, the way Dr. Silva is posing those as alternatives and wants us to move? I'd speak for myself and say I would be learning an awful lot about color blindness from Michelle Alexander, because I would be the one leading the charge to be colorblind. It just seems like that's the way to go. But I find out the more I stay with her text and other illuminating writers such as Cornel West, who we had cited before, but when you read a book that presents the inability to deal with race in this country, it becomes clear that being non-racist is not the answer. It's avoiding the question. So I'm really wondering where the two of you might want to jump in at this point.
Well, to follow that up, the problem, I think, inherently rests with not dealing with your history, not dealing with our history, not dealing with American history. So you have individuals reading the new Jim Crow, not even knowing what the old Jim Crow was. So what she does is push that envelope as well. What is the old Jim Crow? Douglas Blackman in 2007 wrote Slavery of a Different Kind, where he talks about the Reconstruction and how this judicial system was created there to forcibly take black men, freed men, place them in the judicial system, and from this Faustian connection, if you will, with big business, help Tennessee Coal help Birmingham Steel, who were companies who flourished and made millions of dollars, who eventually, some of these same businesses have come out today and relayed Wachovia Bank, relayed they've had connections, and yes, they did benefit from the Jim Crow of the Old South. So once we start working our history, learning our history, then it opens up doors for us to attempt to better the situation that Miss Alexander puts out.
It's a terrible question, Steve, but you're a history professor. I know that. At the university, which is so progressive in its approach to VORP and the whole idea of the Peace Center, are you seeing that the work of people like Michelle Alexander will be having an increasing ability to be taught and used in your own graduate programs?
I imagine it will. The faculty use provocative books all of the time. It's part of their role to raise these questions. A good percentage of our students take courses on racial patterns and ethnic patterns in American history. And I hope that her book, I know Cornell West's book has been used on our campus and still is, and I hope that there'll be good discussion in the coming years.
Karen, can you give us that reference of how we could reach you to pursue your own quest to have people in dialogue with you about this program?
Yes, I can be reached at karen.crozier@fresno.edu, or my campus phone number is 453-2020, and we'll be happy to give people more information about the various events and activities that are taking place around the new Jim Crow. One that is coming up on October 19th at the university from 5:30 to 8 will be a peacemaking circle meeting engaging the new Jim Crow in reference to a restorative practice that invites us to look at ourselves as well as look at the matter at hand, which is Alexander's new Jim Crow phenomenon.
I want to thank you for being here today, our wonderful panel of Dr. Crozier, Dr. Varvis, and Dr. Mitchell. Be back again next week, please, for another program. We are so glad to be able to air such important programs and hope you are enjoying them as much as we are enjoying creating them for you. God bless.